the figures look for the company. We think of this as practical. It gives us something to hold on to. It's based in the real world. It can be justified and is rational, and it's expected. So what's interesting about this is that when you're thinking about the observable, all this seems like pretty sensible stuff. The problem, though, is that no disruptive innovation actually has these characteristics. I mean, imagine an innovation that was simply practical, based in the real world, rational and obvious and expectable. It probably wouldn't be an innovation if it had those characteristics. So one of the things that brain science does is it takes us into the non-rational world. And I really like to make a distinction between non-rational and irrational, because irrational is something that doesn't make sense, whereas non-rational is something that is beyond the rational. The third thing is, what I found when I would go into companies and talk to companies about innovation, companies were used to very vague processes. And one of the questions that I think brain science can answer is, what can you target specifically to improve innovation? And so when you think about the innovative brain, and we have a lot of research that shows us why people who are innovative are different from people who are not, we see that some of the lights are on in the brain, but some of them are off. And by asking the right kinds of questions, which we're going to be talking about today, we will learn how to turn those lights on. And so targeting specific brain regions and functions is something that brain science can specifically offer. And these systems of thinking are really what add a lot of order to what we deliver, and they also allow us to measure the impact of what we're delivering, so that if we need to change something, we can. Fourthly, one of the questions that we ask is, can brain science provide alternate frames? And in a very vivid way, for a lot of us in these kinds of economic times, the brain's flashlight, which is the attentional center of the brain, which is between the frontal and parietal cortex, and you'll notice throughout this presentation, you don't actually need to know what the names of the brain regions are. If you know that the attentional flashlight, when it's focused on threat, will give you a certain kind of approach to the problem, as opposed to when you ask your brain, what is the solution? Because in the threat mode, there are a lot more instinctual responses that we have to business problems. The fifth is that it's highly visual, and as you can already see, it can improve learning. For example, I could tell you that in order to innovate, we really need to think creatively and expansively. And once you start hearing all those adjectives and adverbs, it's really difficult at some point to say, well, what exactly do you mean? Whereas if I say the frontopolar cortex, which is where the red light is flashing, is what we need to access, and these are the ways, 1, 2, 3, that we can access that region, it really makes the whole issue of innovation not just for people who have the ability to grasp creative and abstract language, but it allows people who want to look at something more concretely to take a look at that. Then the next fact is, can the brain really be simulated? And here, I really would like to show you this video, which is a video. This particular video is a video of a robot called Diego. And Diego is a robot made by Hanson Robotics, and is a very remarkable robot, because what Diego shows is that the human brain can actually be mimicked. And one of the questions we ask is, if you can make a machine mimic an ideal brain, why could you not have a human do that within a corporation? And so if you take a look at this particular video, you'll see that Diego's kind of a fascinating creature, because Diego's a robot, but Diego's actually been sort of made to mimic emotional expressions. And what Diego can do is smile, because Diego has lenses in his eyes that allow him to connect with what's going on, to have the appropriate response. So when he needs to smile, he can smile. When he needs to look neutral, he can look neutral. And they've programmed a whole lot of different images of Diego in order to show us that you can take an understanding of neural circuits and wire a robot to do that same thing. That's an expression of surprise. So if you can do that with machines, my point to you would be, why can we not use that as a heuristic to actually start doing this with human beings? And so that's the point about Diego, and another reason that I think we really can pay attention to this. Now, I'm sure a lot of you can relate to the fact that it's very difficult to actually change what's going on in the external world. There's volatility, You can try a little of this and that, but it's difficult to change that. You cannot control the stock market. But since you cannot change reality, can you change the eyes that see reality? And by inference, can you change the brain that's connected to the eyes? Because the world will appear as your brain decides to perceive it. And what we're going to be going through today is teaching you alternate models that we use in product innovation so that you can help share this knowledge with people within corporations. Now, just to stress, what we're doing today is really an overview, and ordinarily just the content we're covering could actually be delivered over 5 to 10 days. So what we're going to be doing today is just illustrating how we can look at specific characteristics in order to take people to their product innovation goals. So let's just ground this learning in a practical case, something that I'm sure a lot of you can relate to. So company A has a dry pipeline, but one of its blockbuster drugs is coming off patent in 2 years. How can you help this company, and how do you use a brain-based approach in order to help this company? So I think a lot of you would know that this whole idea of coming off patent in 2 years is always a little surprising when companies that are pharmaceutical companies, for example, are making drugs, because you think you've had so many years on patent, why did you not approach this previously? Well, at that point, it's too late to say that, because you are now faced with a company that needs to figure out how it's not going to lose all of their income to generics. And you need to help them figure out how they can start to develop an innovative product based on what they've already got. So what does this company need? I mean, in the most fundamental way, this company needs innovation, and it needs innovation fast. But if we look at this in greater detail, what we see is that the company doesn't just need idea innovation, for a whole lot of smart people to get together and come up with something. It actually needs product innovation, which means after you have the idea, you need to execute on that idea, go through with the strategy, create the product, and then figure out everything else related to that, the marketing, the sales, the distribution, how you're actually going to be releasing that product. The innovation doesn't just stop at the idea level. It actually needs to carry through the rest of the chain of events. And this particular quote by Rosabeth Moss-Cantor, I think, explains how most companies are perceived, because there are grand declarations about innovation, which are usually followed by mediocre execution that produces anemic results. And part of this is that the notion of innovation is so abstract to people that leaving it in that abstraction doesn't really help. So how can we then take this abstraction and make it more concrete? Well, let's look at some of the components of what a company in this position may need. If you are a company doing business as usual and you suddenly need a product innovation, you're going to need a change in your strategy. And we'll talk a little bit about what that means. You're also going to need a speedier strategy, because you can't, having a change is fine, but if you can't bring the product to market in a short period of time, you're going to be losing money. And the third thing you need is actually thinking about specifically how you're going to get a group of people together to actually think about innovating around that product. So what can brain science offer with regard to change? Well, there are unbelievable number of change management programs out there. And of course, if you help someone recognize what they want and where they want to go to, presumably you will be able to help them change. But if it were that easy, none of us would actually be recognizing the challenges that are inherent with change. Now, one of the things that brain science does is brain science allows us to look at the change region in the brain, the action center in the brain, which is where the change needs to occur, right? So if you're in a company, you're actually going to need to start physically behaving differently. You have to start thinking about reorganizing your work in a completely different way. And in order to figure out how to make this change in a short period of time, the human brain takes much of its instruction from the brain's GPS system. The brain's GPS, the posterior parietal cortex, actually just draws up all these motor maps to help the brain figure out how to get to its goal. And anyone who's worked within a company, and we'll talk about this later, will know that that's not just a one-step process. It's actually a multiple-step process, and a lot of times you make mistakes along the way. But without brain science, if we did not know all the different regions that feed into the GPS, we would not be able to ask the right questions so that we can construct the motor map that can then move people into action. So one of the biggest things that brain science can do for us is brain science can actually help us create questions to feed the GPS that can then direct us in the best possible way. And the way we do that is by just learning how the different regions, the fear region, the accountant of the brain, there are multiple regions that we would generally teach, and we have questions for each of them, so there's a system to actually take you to your goal. So elucidating the unconscious factors that affect change as well is something that is particularly helpful when it comes to brain science. Now let's take a look at strategic speed. Something I think any company would love to know more about. How do you get yourself back on track and back on track really fast? Well, there are three elements to strategic speed that have been described in a book by Jocelyn Davis and colleagues, The Forum Corporation. And companies that move really fast generally distinguish themselves on the basis of three factors: clarity, unity, and agility. Now, that sounds really great that we're able to identify that, but what does that actually mean? What does it mean to be clearer, to be unified, to be more agile? And is there a system that we can use to really use a structured process within an organization to achieve those goals? Well, let's just look, and this is just one piece of this, but let's look at brain clarity and say, well, if you went into a company and you were talking to an innovation team, how would you have them increase the level of clarity about what they want to achieve? Well, what we talk about are brain clouds that block the action center of the brain, and in order to identify these brain clouds, we really need to understand what are the things that can block the action center in the brain. And to answer that question, we actually have an index that looks at those types of clouds called the possibility index. And the possibility index is an assessment tool that we've developed to be able to measure the degree of burnout, of being lost, of whether someone's already given up on the innovation because they don't feel like they're creative, whether they've been conditioned to think in the same way over and over again, whether they're simply depressed or anxious, whether they have biased attention so they can't focus, or they have difficulty imagining. And once you're able to identify where the vulnerabilities are, you can go in and coach in that particular area. The other types of clouds which are really important are what we call psychological traps. And I initially had all of these slides in here, but then recognized that it probably is too much information. What I really would like to share with you today is that we have a large number, we have basically 8 psychological traps. And each of those traps has a set of questions that you can use to ask an innovation team about. And by asking them that, you can help them not remain in the status quo, not be overly prudent. You can help them to clear the way to much clearer thinking by asking specific questions that target each of these traps that relates to a brain region. So as much as we all like to think that we think really clearly every day, and that we really know what we're doing and where we're going, there's nobody in the world who actually is not susceptible to these psychological traps. So one of the reasons we've really invested in creating these systems of thinking is because if you don't have these check-in points, it's actually very difficult to get to a place where you can actually make sure that you're being thorough in this kind of process. Then there's the issue of unity. And unity, we talk about it there are a lot of people within companies who sort of think of this as a really nice idea, but how can you actually achieve this in terms of team alignment? How can you, and what does the brain have to do with this at all? Now, we have a 3-day program on just this aspect of development within a product innovation team alone, but just to point out one concept in terms of unique insights around team commitment. One of the things is that when we are listening to someone else, our brains are registering what they're saying, right? And we act as if we're 2 separate people. But the real issue is that when something is going on in the brain of one person, like you can see here, that actually gets mirrored in the brain of the other person, because we have a system of mirror neurons that have been detected that are in the frontal, in the parietal, and in the temporal lobes, and these neurons together create a brain mirror that automatically mirrors somebody else's feelings or thoughts or intentions. So you might ask, well, that's a nice finding, but what does that actually mean, and why do I need to care about that when it comes to product innovation? Well, if you look at a team of brains, it's not just their individual brains, but they're mirrors that you're dealing with. This person is mirroring B, C, and D. B is mirroring A, C, and D. And then each person is not just mirroring the other person, they're also mirroring the mirrors in the other person's brain. So what does this mean practically? What it means is that we can then understand why it is that it's really important to understand that when you're in a group, your brain is not your own. It's actually your brain plus everybody else's brain in that group. And so what studies have shown is that it is possible to create a collective intelligence that is greater than the sum of intelligences, the average intelligence, or the maximum intelligence. So the collective intelligence in a group was initially thought to be related to being female, turn-taking, and social sensitivity. But after the analyses were done, the only variable that stood up was social sensitivity. Now what social sensitivity is, it's not just being a sensitive person. It's essentially knowing how to use the techniques, for example, of cognitive empathy, a technique that we would teach so that, and that has been shown to improve results in negotiation. You know, if you use that technique as opposed to just being sensitive or emotionally empathic, it can actually improve your results. So to get to collective intelligence within a group that's focused around innovating around a product, you really want to enhance social sensitivity and enhance the ways in which they communicate, and we can teach many of those brain-based ways. And then when it comes to agility, this is a particularly important piece, and I'll slow down a little bit here because there are systems of thinking that I'd like to communicate to you, and we have a very powerful system that can work on its own or also work together with any kind of software you may have. You know, there's some pretty cool software in the market right now. There's a software that Rally Software has called FlowDoc and Agile Zen, and these are pieces of software that help coordinate teams so that they can become more agile. Well, one of the questions we ask is, and as you could see in the summary of this webinar, is what do you do if you hit a wall? Okay, so you've hit a wall, you simply don't know what to do because you're 2 years from your product coming off patent. You've tried to think about things. It's too short a time to develop a new product. And you simply don't know what to do. Well, one of the things we can teach is that when you hit a wall, you have an obstruction to change, and you can't move along your determined course. And if you cannot move along your course, if you cannot keep going because the wall is in your way, what this says in the brain is that the brain hits a wall. And so if you hit a wall, what's the most natural thing to do? The most natural thing to do is to periscope over that wall. And so we have a technique that we call learning about periscoping. This is actually a telescope, but learning about periscoping, so that usually the way in which we work, you know, if you were in a product innovation group, you would have people being very motivated. They'd come to action. They'd form groups. They'd feel rewarded because they'll have 10 ideas. Those ideas motivate them. They feel more motivated. They come to action. They reduce the ideas. They feel motivated. They come to action until eventually they have a decision, and then they do what they do. But in many teams, this is not the cycle that continues. In many teams, you get rewarded, you feel motivated, you come to action, it doesn't work out. Then you don't feel rewarded. And then all of a sudden, you're not feeling motivated. And then you don't feel like acting. So essentially, you've hit a wall. Well, in the brain, when you hit that wall, you have to take your brain out of that circuit into another circuit that's running at the same time. And the way you would do that is by asking the relevant questions that would turn on the light bulbs in each of those areas. So it turns out that while that circuit is running, there actually is another circuit that's running that can help you reorganize your brain. And this circuit involves short-term memory, attention, and the conflict center. And just to briefly explain how you would actually manage this, the specific thing you would say is, what is the short-term threat and opportunity? Where else can we look? And what conflicts exist? And if you actually do this as an exercise, which we would ordinarily do in a workshop, you'll find that all of a sudden, the wall that you hit feels like it's going away because you're not stuck at that wall. You're looking at somewhere else that's relevant in order to get you to your goal. Then there's a concept of bottlenecks. And the question arises, well, what do you do if you are at a bottleneck and if you're trying to think about how you're going to reroute the brain? You know, is there some way in which you can get past this thing that's slowing you down? Well, as we said earlier, brain-based strategic speed involves clarity, unity, and agility. We've talked about clarity, which is brain clouds and psychological traps, and the specific questions you can ask to turn on those light bulbs in those areas so that you can begin to help people develop a system of thinking to get to their goals. Secondly, unity, and we've talked about what social sensitivity is and how we can teach many techniques to enhance this, including the technique of cognitive empathy. And then the third is agility, and there are actually many paradigms for agility. I'm just showing you two of the many paradigms we have. One is hitting a wall. The other is what do you do when you're in a bottleneck? Well, when you're in a bottleneck, what you actually need to do is update the information. Because when you're in a bottleneck, part of what's happening is something's frozen and old information is taking you down the same old path, and you're really slowed down. So you need to ask yourself, is there an off-ramp? Is there some other way I can get out of this? How can I actually update the information that's going on in my brain? And I think one of the things that a lot of people make a mistake about is sort of having a strategy and then simply executing without recognizing that constant updating, especially in this environment, is necessary. If you don't update information regularly, you're really not allowing your organization to be agile, because what you're trying to pretend is that the market is the same. It's like saying, I'm going to develop this product and I don't really care what else is happening in the market. Like, not keeping your eyes and ears open might make you go through execution by developing a product that eventually may already be on the market, or a product that's highly competitive with yours so that yours doesn't have any differentiating characteristics. So part of what we need to do is to tap in to this updating circuit. We need to ask ourselves, how do we tap into this particular region of the brain that's involved in updating? And there's a part of the brain that signals a need to change, right? So if you're doing something and you find that you're in a bottleneck, you could deny it, but there's a part of your brain, the posterior cingulate, that's saying, hey, something needs to change here, and we need to update. And part of what we need to do is say, what are the risks of the change? If I'm going to be changing lanes to get to an off-ramp, I've got to make sure I look over my shoulder. I've got to make sure that this is a real off-ramp. I've got to make sure that the off-ramp is going to take me to my goal. I've got to assess the risks. And then I've got to also assess the value, right? I've got to make sure that I'm making the right choice to take the off-ramp when I need to get me out of the bottleneck. So, what is this and how do you do any of this? Well, to check in with yourself to make sure you're computing each step is really critical. And the ways in which we check in with ourselves are, we ask ourselves, how do we target each of these regions that's involved in updating, in signaling the need for change, in asking about risk and asking about value? And so by asking these questions, you literally can, if we had the time, we would go into an exercise where I would ask, well, is anxiety blocking my course? And how can I reframe that in 5 ways? Do I need to change the course? What are my options? And switch cost. And switch cost is something we teach, which is the cost of change, and how can you calculate that cost so you can face it, figure out what you're going to pay for it, and then make the change. And then you can ask, what are the risks that are known or potentially unknown, and how do I manage them? And then what's the value of my decision? Is this something that I really need to do, or do I need to do something else in order to get my work done faster overall? So far what we're talking about is really sort of thinking about how we can change the brain so that the brain is able to be more agile. And if you have any questions, please write them down or enter them in the chat box or ask at the end of this, and I'll try to leave a decent amount of time so we have time to actually talk about some of this. And there will be some good news about this kind of dense information that I'm going through fairly rapidly at the end of this presentation. In terms of figuring out how to get to strategic speed, we have a whole module that's brain-based that actually can help you increase clarity within organizations or someone you're coaching, increase agility, and then increase unity, and try to help develop the insights so they understand why this eventually is going to impact the business decision. So the first thing that we want to bring a company to is change, which we've already talked about, and there's a large number of, we actually run a 3-day workshop that's specifically targeted at how to help companies make the changes they want. The second is increasing the strategic speed, which we've already covered. And the third is, how do we change the specific targets for product innovation? So you're sitting there, you've got this dry pipeline, you're trying to figure out how do I get to my goal? What am I going to do practically? When you get called into an organization, you're going to say, well, I've got a way of working with you over 6 months to help you increase your innovation. And the way we're going to do this is by doing A, B, C, D, E. And we do have a process like that. And what's really great is that we can actually measure what's going on with the process, which I'll tell you about later on. But just to look at one or two elements of what this product innovation strategy would actually allow us to do. So as I said before, when we're innovating, there are some lights that are turned off, and we actually want to turn the relevant lights on. And how do we do this? Well, there are two things that I'd like to focus on today. One is brainstorming, and the other is generic parts technique. Now, brainstorming is usually very misused. If somebody asks you to come into a company and you say, well, why don't you get your most innovative people together and we'll just throw around some ideas and see if we can get somewhere. Firstly, it's not that sophisticated. And secondly, it's assuming that that group is actually going to work out. What we know is that brainstorming can be helpful, but only under certain circumstances. Firstly, the group has to have a goal. Okay? If you don't have a goal and you're just trying to figure out where you're going, you could get somewhere, but having a goal really helps to anchor the group together. Secondly, in brainstorming, what the research is showing is that turn-taking is not actually that helpful. That if I wait for you and then I'm quiet all the time and try to suppress all my ideas, it actually doesn't help the brainstorming process. So the other extreme is everybody shouting out at the same time, which is really not possible. But what you can develop in the group is a tolerance for intrusion and then coming back to the person. So if I'm talking and you say, hey, wait a minute, I just thought, why don't you tell us about the disadvantages of brainstorming as well? I would say, yeah, actually, I'm going to get to that. So that's fine. And rather than saying, why are you interrupting me, I would recognize that you had a thought about why it was important, and I would step back and then be able to step forward. So having that competency not to always feel like you have to be in a turn-taking mode is particularly helpful. Thirdly, brainstorming is helpful when it activates older knowledge. A lot of people forget that just because you know something doesn't mean you're going to retrieve it. So what's the system that you're going to be using to retrieve that knowledge? Because knowledge that you've gained over the years is in your head, and you have a sensation that you remember that. But can you actually go in and get it when you need it, when you're talking to a company? Then there's the idea of cognitive persistence despite failure. I mean, you all know this feeling, let's get together and have a group talk. And you have this group think, and you're thinking it's really great, but then you realize that it's going nowhere, and you feel like it's failing. And you get that funny feeling in your stomach like it's not actually going to work out. Well, creating an atmosphere of cognitive persistence, like an attitude towards failure, like, okay, we're failing down this path, but because of cognitive persistence, how do we go to plan B? How do we go to plan C? Creating that mentality within a brainstorming group is really important, and you can actually coach people on how to get there. And then studies have also shown that certain kinds of cognitive stimulation, like music, can actually be very helpful to people in helping them figure out how they can get to their goals. So in order for brainstorming to be effective, you really need to have a goal. You need to have no turn-taking. It needs to activate older knowledge, and you need to have cognitive persistence despite failure and cognitive stimulation. Now, there are conditions under which brainstorming is also not that helpful. It actually is hurtful. And you get, there's what you call social loafing. It starts off as a serious project, and then people have their feet up on the table and they're eating things, and it essentially just becomes a loafing session. It's very enjoyable. People love doing it. There are a couple of ideas that are thrown about, but you're not actually reaching a business goal. And so somebody in the group really needs to be monitoring for when this is happening and non-judgmentally sharing when you've crossed over that threshold. Then there are groups where you have evaluation apprehension. People are apprehensive about, well, what are they going to think about what I'm feeling? Well, part of what we need to do is set the standard for the group and say, in this group, we are not evaluating. We are simply looking at the ideas and thinking about what we're thinking. There's no stupid idea. And once you create an atmosphere like that, studies show that it actually is helpful. Then there's production blocking, which is when someone's beginning to come up with an idea, someone else tries to shut them up. And this is really hurtful in the brainstorming process because very valuable ideas actually get left out. So if you think about an introspective person, for example, who's not very forceful, who's got a brilliant idea, and starts to speak up, and everyone realizes it's too boring to listen to, or they're taking too long. So they eventually try to tell themselves, well, I guess I'm not going to express it. This actually hurts the brainstorming process. And then in terms of cognitive persistence, not having cognitive persistence can also be hurtful. So what we've developed is what we call a brainstorm compass. It's an assessment tool that allows you to work with a group that's brainstorming so you can figure out how much social loafing is there, have people really abandoned judgment, is there enough room for diverse opinion, do they have this attitude of persevering, and is there excessive turn-taking, or is there enough flexibility in the group? And by using this brainstorm compass, you can actually help hold the group to a set of phenomena so they can execute on the product innovation that they want to execute on. Then we come to the last content part, which is about the generic parts technique. And this is one of several techniques. If somebody called us into a company and said, we need somebody to help us with product innovation, we would introduce you to all the tool sets that we have that can help you increase your product innovation, and what the specific steps were that you could take, and how you could set a certain number of weeks per technique in order to reach a goal. So generic parts technique, big words for essentially saying that it's based on the fact that when we look at a situation in a company, we try to look at obscure things, and we break the components into component parts. So rather than just looking at something as, well, I'm a pharmaceutical company, what am I actually? I'm a company that's invested in health. I'm a company, or a lot of pharmaceutical companies, for example, recognize recently that they don't actually only have to have drugs and patent, they can have a generics arm. So once they start to broaden the definition of who they are and realize, I'm just interested really in delivering the right kind of medicines to the right kind of people, you then realize you can extend your definition beyond yourself. So breaking the concept into component parts is important. And the most recent operational definition has shown that for any particular product that you're looking at, there are 32 factors that you can look at, including shape, parts, material, and the author of this is McCaffrey from UMass, who's actually looked at this technique and found it to be incredibly helpful. Now, the result of the generic parts technique is you have decreased functional fixedness. And what that means is you don't only think of your product within the role in which it was delivered. So if you say, well, my company is really only about producing drugs, that gives you one set of options for products. But if you say we're focused on healthcare, it gives you another set of options for products, including educational products. Or if you say we're interested in investigational tools, that opens up another set. So rather than just being closed in by being one company doing one thing, you're actually a company that doesn't define itself by one function. You extend the number of functions. So in brain terms, what is functional fixedness? So let's take a look at this process, which is called long-term potentiation. And long-term potentiation is simply when brain cells keep on firing in the same way all the time. They get stuck in this pattern. And so as a result of this, there's a complete fixedness that goes on. And these two slides briefly explain why this occurs.
Input from a presynaptic neuron leads to firing in a postsynaptic neuron. Increased stimulation from the presynaptic neuron causes increased firing of the postsynaptic neuron. But in LTP, the postsynaptic neuron continues to fire at an elevated rate, even after the increased stimulation has subsided.
And then we take a look at the next slide.
There are two explanations for what actually occurs at the molecular level during LTP. One hypothesis suggests that the presynaptic neuron fires at a normal rate, releasing an elevated amount of neurotransmitter.
If you release more neurotransmitter, you're going to get a bigger response in the postsynaptic neuron. The other way is actually to, for example, modify the receptor function so the receptors are more sensitive to the neurotransmitter.
In this second model, a normal amount of neurotransmitter is released, but the increased sensitivity of the receptor causes the postsynaptic neuron to fire at an elevated rate.
And so those concepts will become much more sensible if we talked about them in greater detail. But essentially what they tell us is that if you are trying to get over old patterns of thinking and you're engaged in product innovation, one of the things you need to do is to essentially elaborate on what's going on, what are the old pathways, what are the old ways of doing things, and then re-encode or set new pathways on top of that. Well, generic parts technique is a way of essentially targeting these new pathways in the brain. So here's an example of what it is. What if I said to you, there are these two metal circular coils, and I'm giving you three things, and I want you to come up with a way to join them. Now, think of this as two parts of the organization, drug A and drug B, or company A and company B. Maybe this company can acquire that company. Maybe this drug can be combined with that drug. Maybe this drug can be combined with an investigation. So how would you join these two components? Well, in the physical problem, what I'm giving you is a candle, a box of matches, and a cube. And I'm asking you, how can you join those different loops? Now, that's it's an interesting problem, because a lot of people will say, well, I'll take the matches and I'll light the candle and I'll use the wax, and using the wax, I'll join those two loops. Well, the problem with that is that it's not going to hold those because they're too heavy. And so I say that to you, and then I say, well, how are you going to join them? And you try all kinds of things. You say, well, maybe I'll fit the block, but the block doesn't fit the hole. And as much as if you look at the system as a set system, it is very difficult to understand the connections. So what we want to do is say, what does each thing mean? Like, what is a candle? A candle is wax and a wick. And if we look at that more closely, wax is the lipid bilayer, and the wick is a piece of string. And studies show that if you decompose that, once you deconstruct that, once you get to string, that's when you realize, wait a minute, there's a string that I can use to tie these together. Whereas if you leave the candle as a candle, it's very difficult to see what the outcomes will be. And so what this example shows is that we have different parts that are involved in any product innovation project. And what we want to do is think about those parts and as independent parts. So break it down as much as you can. What does it look like? What is the function? What is the form? How can I make these all be related? How will I relate a match to the string, a match to the lipid bilayer? How would I relate the block to that? How would I relate the block molecules? Sorry, that was just how do I relate the block molecules to that? So here, having parts and looking at that function free are really important. So here's a classical example from Gillette that had a toothbrush unit, which was Oral-B, an appliance unit that was Braun, and a battery unit, which was Duracell, but failed to make a battery-powered toothbrush because they were looking at the innovation in a very different way. Right? They were actually looking at the innovation only in terms of each of the independent units and not looking across different product lines to try to see what would happen. So if you were working with company A, part of what you'd want to say is, just tell me what products you've got, and then sit with me and let's figure out how we're going to deconstruct what this product is. Like, what is this product? Because if you did that, you might realize there's another indication you might use it for. There might be something that's it's already being used off-label for that would lead to faster development. So once you really try to go into the situation and apply this general technique, what studies show is that GPT-trained people solve 67.4% more of insight problems than simple association. So that's 2/3 the time more productive by using this technique. And what I've really given you is an overview. What we would generally teach and work with people around is, let's take this construct and apply it to your situation. And my general approach to this is, I don't really feel that we're at a point where we can go in and tell people generic things anymore. I think if you're hiring us for product innovation, tell us what the products are and what you want to innovate and by when. And if we're using this technique, every step of the way needs to be applied to the specific thing that you're looking at, rather than simply saying, well, let me just tell you these techniques and then leave you and say goodbye, and we'll figure out later how we're going to achieve that. So the practical application of this technique then, and as I said, this is just one of several, is that we use GPT rather than association. And there are lots of other ways in which we can use analogies, we can use metaphors, and a whole lot of other techniques to help you figure out how you can get to your goal. And depending on the project and what you want to achieve, it may not be necessary to use all of these products. You may actually want to just use one or two of them. Now, one of the things I want to emphasize is the way we work and the way we would encourage anyone that we're talking to work is not to simply operate within the silo of your unique identifier. You know, brain science is a relatively unique identifier for us. We do use brain science together with things. As you can see, sometimes it's central to thinking about what are we going to target. Sometimes it's used as an explanation of what habit pathways in the brain are. The brain science is really just one piece of what this approach to product innovation can teach you. Because when you integrate the brain science intelligently with the business science and with the organizational psychology, what you end up having is the ability to really target strategy and business impact. Now, I'm sure one of the questions at the back of many people's minds are, well, some of these facts sound kind of interesting, but how am I going to remember this? And you know, I was sort of inspired to think about this when I thought a lot of experienced trainers and coaches are often older because they just have more experience. But the problem with that is you also forget more. So how can we sort of help or assist experienced trainers deal with this kind of situation where there's so much information? And what we've created is a piece of software called Jounce. And what Jounce is something that will allow you to go into a company. It will allow you to deliver, to basically say what is it that you want to achieve in terms of business impact. And we're consulting with some of the world's leaders in this. Patty and Jack Phillips of the ROI Institute are consulting with us on how to develop these measures. And this is pretty near completion. It will be released to beta by the second week of May. Right now, that's our target date. Once you go into a company and you say, what do you want to achieve? And they say, I want to make a new product, and I need to do this within the year. Then you know what that is. The system will then tell you which modules are relevant to deliver. You'll deliver them, and it will tie this to business impact and automatically generate a graph, so you'll be able to see if at the end of each session, you're actually reaching your goal. And we've tried to make it easier for everyone, so if you're using this particular technique, it will not only give you all the written content, it will give you all the PowerPoint along with it to work with a group or an individual. It will give you assessment tools that you can automatically send to other people. By just clicking on the tool, it goes to the other person, they fill it out, they give it back to you. And if you haven't had a chance to really go thoroughly over something, a session before, it will help you by giving you guideline questions to ask during the coaching session. For me, what's the most exciting part about this is that it actually also allows you, at the end of every session, to come up with actions, because this is a very action-oriented system of coaching that takes all the brain science, all the business science, all the organizational psychology, and at the end of that session says, what are you going to do today that's going to be different? And because it's an action, it can be tied to the business impact, and by the end of that time, you not only have relevant modules tied to strategy, you also have the ability to be agile yourself, because if something's not working out, you can change the strategy to help people reach their goals. So the conclusion here is that product innovation really requires sustained and effective change, strategic speed, and specific innovative techniques. And that brain science is really only helpful when it's integrated with organizational psychology and when it's integrated with business science, but most helpful when it's integrated with business impact. And the reason we say this is that some of the largest companies in the world, some of the most brilliant minds in the world, have consulted and given the wrong opinions. And one of the areas we can really try to address is, if my advice to you is not working out early on, how can I change my strategy? Because my opinion is that the best people developers, or the best people who are consulting to strategy and execution within a company, are people who can be agile themselves. And by using the software like Jounce, for example, you can actually not just deliver information, not feel like you have to remember everything, because actually it's all there for you and for the client, and you can automatically exchange things. If you're sitting with an iPad, you can automatically sit one-to-one with someone and do this, but it also helps you measure the impact, and for us, that is really the most important piece. So that's the content that I'm very excited to have shared with you today. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to take them, and I'll stop sharing my screen right now. Any questions?
Hello, if there is no questions, If there is a question, I just want to thank Dr. Pillay for the presentation. I know that he has left you with a lot of curiosity and a lot of interest in the theme, in the topic. So I know a lot of you will get in touch with all of us for more information about Dr. Pillay's approach to innovation, which is something that we really need in these days. So with this, I just want to thank you, Dr. Pillay, for the opportunity to share with all these wonderful people your knowledge. And I feel very much appreciated in you choosing Zona de Recursos to present your, your knowledge. So thank you, and we will get in touch.
Thank you very much, Nora, and thank you very much to everyone who's attended, and hope that we can approach the whole world of coaching and people development and strategy together as a team by really tightening up on what we're delivering related to business strategy. And if you have any questions at any point, please feel free to email us at solutions@neurobusinessgroup.com.
Muchas gracias a todos los que estuvieron aquí en esta presentación, y yo creo que, ¿verdad?, es un tema innovador a su vez, y yo espero que todos ustedes, ¿verdad?, pues hayan tomado ¿verdad?, notas, y estaremos hablando más adelante sobre el tema. Otra vez, muchas gracias al Dr. Pillay, y pronto nos estaremos comunicando. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you.
No puedo pelear. Stop recording.